Greetings. My name is Mary McCaskill, and I have prepared this presentation for Dr. Gallimore's epistemology capstone class at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. The topic of this presentation is A Priori Knowledge and the Scope of Philosophy by George Beeler. To give this paper a little context, it was written by George Beeler, like I said, and was originally published in 1996 in the journal Philosophical Studies, an international journal for philosophy in the analytic tradition. It was also published, I thought pretty interestingly, it was also published along with critiques by William Lycan and Ernest Sosa, and also the issue included a reply from Beeler to Lycan and Sosa. I thought that was pretty interesting to have all three in one. I'm sure it was pretty exciting for all of them too. So to begin our foray into this article, we start with the very bold claims of Beeler supporting philosophical rationalism versus radical empiricism. His overarching goal in the article is to prove the authority and the autonomy of philosophy. The autonomy of philosophy being that among the central questions of philosophy that can be answered by one standard theoretical means or another, most can in principle be answered by philosophical investigation and argument without relying substantively on the sciences. And for the authority of philosophy, as opposed to the autonomy, he says, insofar as science and philosophy purport to answer the same central philosophical questions, in most cases the support that science could in principle provide for those answers is not as strong as that which philosophy could in principle provide for its answers. So should there be conflict, the authority of philosophy in most cases can be greater in principle. In reviewing this paper, it seemed interesting that Beeler would make such polarizing claim. And although well thought out, these claims are not now and were not then really accepted views on how we substantiate intuitions as evidence, which we'll talk more about. So Beeler says there are two ways to explain the authority of philosophy. One is the argument from concepts, and as he describes in his paper, the argument from evidence. His argument for evidence is as follows. First, that intuitions are evidence. Second, that modal reliabilism is a correct explanation of why intuitions are evidence. Three, that modal reliabilism implies the authority and autonomy of philosophy. Four, that scientific essentialism is no bear. And five, the conclusion that the authority and autonomy of philosophy hold, which again is kind of a bold statement, especially against the radical empiricists. So talking about intuitions as evidence, which is the first premises, rational insights or intuitions are described by Kuntz. This is one of the articles that I read in support of this effort, as mental states or events in which a proposition seems true in the manner of these propositions. Beeler describes them as seeming, which seems to be a good explanation. When I was looking at the Standard Encyclopedia of Philosophy, then they actually use this kind of idea of seemings from Beeler in the entry for intuition. And he says that for you to have an intuition, that A is just for it to seem to you that A, and that this is sort of a seeming, and that it's a conscious episode. For example, there's sort of a moment when first contemplating if P, then not P, that it just seems necessarily true. So that's kind of the idea around intuitions that he starts with. He also points out that beliefs and intuitions are not the same. One can have an intuition without a belief and vice versa. And it's also possible to influence what a person believes through, he says through cajoling, intimidation, and brainwashing, but this is not the case for intuitions. Intuitions, you just sort of seem to know. It's difficult to influence someone, and or actually probably can't, as he's pointing out, influence anyone really in their intuitions, whereas you can in their beliefs. And so in this way, he describes a plasticity, whereas beliefs have a higher plasticity in that they can be influenced, whereas intuitions do not. They're a lot less plastic. He also, another big part of his argument, he outlines a justification procedure of how we sort of come to intuitions and how we, I guess in a way, validate them for ourselves in that conscious effort. So first he says we canvass intuition, so we get the intuitions, and then we subject those to dialectical critique, or just sort of, are they logical? Does it make sense? And then construct theories that systemize the surviving intuitions. Which ones are similar, which ones have similar pieces. Then testing those theories against further intuitions, and then repeating the process until equilibrium is approached, until it's just kind of evident that this is an intuition and not just some other conscious thought or phenomenon. So since the justification process that we just talked about yields intuitions that have been systematically vetted, then as a standard view allows intuitions or evidence. But while the standard view regards intuitions as evidence, many others, including radical empiricists, reject this view since intuitions are not reliant on empirical means and therefore cannot accurately reflect the external world. To address this, Beeler compares more empiricist views, notably visualism, to intuition. Visualism is the belief that only visual experiences can be used as evidence, as opposed to other sensory inputs like tactile or auditory inputs. So he compares visualism with intuitions by running them through the justification process that we just talked about. And he concludes that the non-visual sources of knowledge and intuition would suffer the same outcome of being thrown out. But this seems absurd given the radical empiricist view of the acceptance of non-visual sources while ignoring intuition. So it just, doesn't seem like a good idea if you could throw out tactile and auditory as inputs of valid evidence, that you could throw out intuition when you look at them through that justification process, then they're very similar in that respect. In addition, he challenges radical empiricists' use of epistemic norms to throw out intuitions while disavowing epistemic norms. So he's basically saying that the empiricists use epistemic norms to kind of evaluate intuitions, but then they don't really agree with epistemic norms, so it just doesn't seem to hold much water for him. And basically what he's saying is that you can't have it both ways. And as you recall from a previous slide outlining Beeler's project, he uses the concept, it was, I think, premises number 2 and 3, he uses the concept of modal reliabilism to explain why intuitions are evidence, and thereby asserting that modal reliabilism infers the autonomy and authority of philosophy. Reliabilism is a non-evidentialist theory that basically says that the justification of a belief is as reliable as the process that produced it. Unlike evidential theories, then, it is the process, not the evidence, that has to be justified. Goldman gives an example of 2 bird watchers that are out one day together when a pink-spotted flycatcher lands on a nearby branch. Both bird watchers form a belief that they are seeing a pink-spotted flycatcher, but the expert is justified in believing that this is true because he's able to form a belief based on pieces of information that he has, either from memory or that he has read, pictures that he's seen. The novice, on the other hand, is simply excited and jumps to the belief without the process of really associating visual or memory cues. So in this way, the expert's process is reliable, whereas the novice's is not. There are also counterexamples to this, and I think we talked some and read in Feldman's book, the counter-arguments against reliabilism. And probably the biggest one, at least in the Feldman book, was the brain in the vat example that we discussed in class. And also, kind of the lucky clairvoyant that, there's a clairvoyant who has the process of kind of seeing the future and is right a lot of the times, but we can't really say that because that process of clairvoyancy seems reliable, that it's actually, a valid form of evidence or a valid process that produces evidence. So in order to save reliabilism from these counterexamples, Buehler divides them into two different types, contingent and modal reliabilism. So he defines reliabilism as something is a basic source of evidence if and only if it has a certain kind of reliable tie to the truth. He then distinguishes between contingent and modal reliabilism by evaluating that tie to the truth rather than looking at the process. So by contingent, he implies that the tie between evidence and the truth is that of dependent pieces of the process and is tied to the truth. In other words, the truth value is dependent on the process. For the clairvoyant example, clairvoyance and the truth of its outcome is contingent on the plausibility of clairvoyance being a reliable method. So if we say that reliabilism is unfounded because it yields results that clairvoyance is plausible, then the results are not really evidence because they were gotten from an unreliable source, kind of like we talked about before. In contrast, modal reliabilism, he says, according to which something counts as a basic source if and only if there's some kind of strong modal tie between its deliverances and the truth. So this is an evaluation of a process and its modal tie to the truth by evaluating the modality of the truth, whether it's necessarily true, as a lot of intuitions are, so as produced by a process and not the process itself, as in contingent reliabilism. So I will say that, that was, it's still kind of a difficult point for me to wrap my head around, and not necessarily the concept, but the fact that it makes the case that he would like for it to, which I think is, again, very interesting that he used this sort of, introductory idea of modal reliabilism that when I was looking, there's just not a whole lot of literature on it other than what he's produced. He used this to make the bold claim of the authority and autonomy of philosophy over empiricism. So I just think that's really interesting. Back to his argument, that, kind of given the plausibility of modal reliabilism in avoiding the counterexamples, and that the force of the justification process that we come by these intuitions was modal reliabilism, and the fact that there is that process that kind of produces these necessary truths for intuitions, then he says intuitions are evidence. There are two additional challenges to his claims that he points out. First, that modal reliability requires high levels of intelligence, and also the idea of scientific essentialism. So just a little about scientific essentialism. It seemed to be, when I was looking at related literature, it seemed to be something that he worked on for a while, although it doesn't seem, there's different references to it, but it doesn't seem to be a very widely published idea. Not that it's, not valid in itself, but it was kind of interesting also, this piece, because it was sort of, and he talks about semantic and rephrasal techniques in sort of describing sort of where empiricism almost meets philosophy, and making sure that the same language is being used to describe the propositions that we use to evaluate things like intuition. That's a really simple version of it, but from one of his papers, Scientific Essentialism, is the doctrine that there are truths that can be known to be necessary only if empirical evidence is used. So, for example, water is indeed made up of 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen, and the 2 are kind of indistinguishable because they are identical. And so, therefore, as scientific essentialism points out, this necessary truth relies on the science of molecular composition. This obviously poses a problem for Beeler, since he's, kind of putting philosophy ahead of science, and kind of eschewing the radical empiricist views. So while scientific essentialism seems to contradict Beeler's central claim of intuitions being free of empirical parts, then he explains it away, like I was saying, kind of through rephrasal strategies, and kind of a plea to semantic stability, which is kind of just in my limited reading of it, is sort of the job of scientific essentialism. So he basically asserts that necessary truths that contain empirical elements can be rephrased and semantically massaged to only contain the cognitive dependent portion of the truth. From this, he says that one of the limits of scientific essentialism is that it relies on semantic instability, and by restoring semantic stability through rephrasal techniques, then you can kind of get rid of that scientific or empiricist piece in intuitions, or in kind of in that vein. So so again, I think it's interesting that he used these points to make such a bold claim. And somehow from this, although I've read through it many times, and I still don't really have a big handle on scientific essentialism, he thinks that he makes the point, although I think Lycan argues with him, but he makes the point that scientific essentialism is no barrier to the autonomy and authority of philosophy. So in conclusion, while Beeler's attempted kind of coup of radical empiricist thought and establishing philosophy as a ruler is noble, it seems to fail to establish his claims based on its reliance on modal reliabilism in establishing intuitions as evidence, and the more lofty goal of establishing the autonomy and authority of philosophy over science. I thought it was interesting, again, that the journal had the article by Beeler and counter-arguments by Lycan and Sosa, and given the uncertain allowance of modal reliabilism, as successfully, I thought, challenged by Lycan and Sosa, Lycan's point being that there are many different kinds of intuitions, and that treating them all the same by evaluating the modal type of truth as a group instead of individually is a bit misleading. And then Sosa's view that Beeler's explanation of intuition as evidence reveals kind of, he points out that it's difficult to, he describes it as a glow. So sort of, why would you understand that an intuition is acceptable, whereas clairvoyance is not? He doesn't really explain away that sort of glow that intuitions are. We can take that process as valid, whereas clairvoyance we can't. So he doesn't think that's what, he explains that away well enough to make his claim and support that overall goal of philosophical rationalism, excuse me, over radical empiricism. So So thank you very much for your time. I hope this review of George Beale's article, A Priori Knowledge and the Scope of Philosophy, has yielded at least some interest in the evaluation of why intuitions are considered evidence in the standard view of knowledge, and hopefully a little bit of insight into how this may be substantiated. So take care and good day.